The nature of Alcatraz matter, the island that was never supposed to be escaped. Cold wind cuts across the bay as waves slam against sharp rocks. Out there, rising from the fog, stands a fortress, isolated, silent, surrounded by icy water and deadly currents. For decades, Alcatraz wasn't just a prison. It was a warning. They said no one could escape it. But inside those walls, men still tried. This is the story of America's most infamous island, and the truth about what really happened behind the rock, the birth of the rock. The story of Alcatraz begins long before it became a prison. Before the steel bars, before the guards, before Al Capone ever walked its hallways, Alcatraz was nothing more than a lonely, windswept island sitting 1.5 miles off the coast of San Francisco. The native Ohlone people once called it Evil Island, believing it was home to dark spirits and restless souls. Even centuries ago, the place carried an aura, a feeling that something about this rocky land was unnatural. In 1775, Spanish explorer Juan Manuel de Ayala charted the island and named it La Isla de los Alcatrazes, the Island of the Pelicans. At first glance, it was just a barren outcrop, but to military minds, it was the perfect fortress, surrounded by freezing, shark-infested waters, impossible to reach or escape. By the mid-1800s, after the California gold rush exploded, San Francisco became one of the richest and roughest cities in America. Lawlessness spread. Robberies, murders, and riots became daily occurrences. The U.S. Army needed a way to protect the booming harbor and to control the chaos. In 1853, they built the first fortress on Alcatraz, a lighthouse, a defensive wall, and eventually an arsenal of cannons. The island became known as the Guardian of the Bay, but over time the threat didn't come from outside. It came from within. During the Civil W. The island became a military prison. Confederate sympathizers, traitors, and deserters were shipped to Alcatraz. The same cells that once stored ammunition now held men. And soon, the army realized something crucial. Alcatraz's isolation made it perfect for punishment. No guards had to chase escapees through woods or streets. There were no alleys to hide in, no friendly towns nearby. If you escaped Alcatraz, the bay itself would kill you. By the early 1900s, the island's role as a prison was official, but its real transformation came during the Great Depression, when America's crime wave hit its peak. The gangster era. When crime ruled America, the 1930s was an age of legends and fear. Bank robbers like John Dillinger, Machine Gun Kelly, and Pretty Boy Floyd roamed the Midwest. They were folk heroes to some, outlaws to others, but to the government, they were a symbol of chaos. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, wanted to send a message. No criminal was untouchable. That's when Alcatraz was reborn. In 1934, the U.S. Department of Justice took control of the island and built a maximum security federal penitentiary designed to do one thing: break the spirit of America's most dangerous men. The new Alcatraz was a masterpiece of control. Each prisoner was given a cell barely 5 feet by 9. There were no friendly faces, no handshakes, no conversations allowed outside strict rules. Guards were trained to maintain silence, because silence was power. The prison's first warden, James A. Johnston, famously said, "If you break the rules, you go to Alcatraz. If you break the rules of Alcatraz, you go to the hole." Every sound echoed, every door clanged shut with finality. And every inmate quickly learned, this wasn't just a place of punishment, it was a psychological weapon. America's most dangerous arrive. On August 11, 1934, the first group of 137 inmates, Aries, led by train and ferry from the federal prison in Atlanta. Among them was a name every American knew: Al Capone. Once the most powerful gangster in Chicago, Capone ruled bootlegging, gambling, and organized crime through money and fear. But here, on Alcatraz, none of that mattered. He wasn't a kingpin anymore. He was prisoner numbered 85. Capone's influence vanished overnight. Guards controlled every move, even the smallest privileges. A warm shower, a magazine, a conversation, had to be earned. For the first time in his life, Al Capone was powerless. He later told a reporter, "It's like I'm on a rock in the middle of the ocean. Even God can't get me out of here." The system of control, Alcatraz operated on a simple philosophy: routine, silence, and isolation. Every inmate followed a precise schedule: wake at 6:30 a.m., breakfast at 7, work from 7:30 to 4, dinner at 4:30, lights out at 9. There was no contact with the outside world, no phone calls, letters were censored, visits were rare and always behind glass. Even meals were eaten in silence. The only sound was the clinking of utensils against metal trays. If an inmate disobeyed, even by speaking out of turn, he could be sent to the Hole, a pitch-black cell beneath D Block, where prisoners were stripped naked, left in the dark, and fed only bread and water. Some lasted days. Others broke after hours. But what made Alcatraz truly terrifying wasn't its brutality. It was its perfection. The guards were disciplined, the routines were strict, and escape seemed physically impossible. The cold currents of San Francisco Bay could freeze a man's muscles within minutes. The waves, the distance, the darkness, it all created the illusion that Alcatraz was inescapable. But illusions, like walls, can crack. The whisper of escape. Even as guards maintained control, prisoners whispered through pipes and vents. Stories spread about the tides, about men who studied guard schedules and smuggled tools from the workshops. One day, he said it out loud: "If a man can build it, a man can escape it." That single idea, whispered through darkness, became the obsession that would define Alcatraz for decades. And as the waves crashed against the rock and the wind howled across the bay, the impossible dream of escape began to take shape. Because Alcatraz wasn't just a prison anymore. It was a challenge. The impossible fortress, security, control, and the fear of freedom. The morning fog rolled over San Francisco Bay like a grey curtain. The water churned below, dark, cold, and unforgiving. For the men trapped inside Alcatraz, that sound, the crash of waves, was both a lullaby and a curse. It reminded them that freedom was just 1 mile away, and completely unreachable. The island was designed to destroy that hope. Every inch of Alcatraz served one purpose: to remind the inmates they were never leaving. The engineering of fear, Alcatraz wasn't just built. It was engineered like a machine. When the Federal Bureau of Prisons took over in 1934, they stripped the old military buildings down to their bones and rebuilt them using reinforced concrete, steel bars, and double-secure gates. The main cell house stood like a fortress, divided into 4 blocks. A block, administrative and isolation units. B and C. Blocks, general population. D block, punishment and solitary confinement, also known as the Hole. Each block contained narrow rows of stacked cells, each barely larger than a closet. Inside, inmates had only a bed, a sink, a toilet, and a small table. No curtains, no privacy, just cold concrete and the echo of others breathing. To ensure total security, Alcatraz used electrified fences, armed guard towers, and metal detectors, technology decades ahead of its time. Guards patrolled with Thompson submachine guns, ready to fire at the first sign of trouble. There were 13 official counts, every day, and each one was done in silence. Guards memorized the faces, mannerisms, and voices of every inmate. If a prisoner even blinked differently, they noticed. And then there was the water, the final barrier. The San Francisco Bay's waters averaged 53 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees, cold enough to numb limbs within minutes. Add strong tides, swirling currents, and sharp rocks, and escape wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. For most men, Alcatraz wasn't just a prison. It was a waiting room for death. Life inside the fortress, day after day, Alcatraz operated like clockwork. Every step, every sound, every breath was monitored. Inmates woke to the clang of steel doors at 6:30 a.m. They washed, dressed, and lined up for breakfast. Meals were plain but efficient: oatmeal, powdered eggs, bread, and coffee. The dining hall, nicknamed the most dangerous room in America, was fitted with tear gas canisters in the ceiling. At the push of a button, guards could flood the entire room in seconds if a riot broke out. After meals, most prisoners were assigned to work details: laundry, kitchen, or factory jobs. The most trusted inmates worked in the Model Industries building, producing furniture and clothing for other federal prisons. Even in work, though, silence ruled. Talking without permission meant losing privileges, or worse, a trip to D Block. The sound of chains, footsteps, and distant waves became the soundtrack of daily life. At night, the foghorn from the Golden Gate Bridge echoed across the bay. Inmates lying in their bunks could sometimes hear the faint sound of music or laughter from the city, the cruelest reminder that freedom was so close, yet impossibly far. One former inmate said, "You could smell the steaks cooking in San Francisco on a good day. That smell alone could drive a man insane." D Block, the hole beneath the rock. D Block was where Alcatraz revealed its true nature. It was the end of the line, a world within a world. There were 42 cells in total. Most inmates sent they were locked up for days or weeks. But a few, the most violent or rebellious, were thrown into the strip cell. The strip cell was completely dark. No light, no mattress, no toilet, just a hole in the floor. Prisoners were kept naked, given only a bucket of water and a slice of bread twice a day. They slept on the concrete floor, their only companion the sound of dripping water and the echo of their own heartbeat. The longest anyone survived that punishment without breaking was rumored to be 19 days. Most begged to go back to regular isolation after just 3. Alcatraz wasn't designed to kill men physically. It was designed to break their minds. The fear of freedom. But here's the strange part. Even with the fear, even with the punishments, Alcatraz never stopped breeding hope. Inside those cells, men plotted, not because they thought they could make it, but because thinking about escape was the only thing that kept them sane. Guards intercepted notes written in soap on mirrors, messages carved into cell walls and coded taps between pipes. The inmates studied everything: the tides, guard routines, the structure of the bars. Some collected bits of metal to make makeshift tools. Others stole spoons from the mess hall, dreaming of tunneling through concrete. To the outside world, Alcatraz was perfect. But inside, a silent war was already being fought. Not with guns or knives, but with patience. A handful of men were about to prove the unthinkable, that even the most secure prison on earth couldn't contain the human will to be free. The cracks begin to show. By the early 1950s, Alcatraz's reputation was starting to shift. The facility was expensive to maintain, costing 3 times more per inmate than any other federal prison. The buildings were old, corroded by salt and wind. The plumbing constantly failed and heating barely worked. But more than that, the inmates were changing. Guards noticed that many new arrivals weren't career criminals. They were men broken by the system. Some were veterans, some were mentally ill, and Alcatraz, with its silence and isolation, was driving them deeper into madness. Suicide attempts increased. Violence spread. In 1 year alone, there were 14 major assaults, 2 murders, and several escape attempts. None succeeded, yet everyone inspired the next. The myth of Alcatraz as inescapable was beginning to crack, and those cracks would eventually split wide open. The rock begins to tremble. For decades, Alcatraz stood as America's symbol of control, a place where fear kept men in line and the sea guarded the walls. But even iron and concrete can't hold back human desperation forever. Inside those cold grey cells, whispers became plans, and plans turned into legend. The rock would soon be tested like never before. And one night, in 1962, it would finally tremble.